Are you comfortable? All good?
Yeah, all good.
Already had our mandatory conversation around what's going on in the world and how everything is so calm and predictable. Remember the days of Brexit when we would all had to start a conversation with, what's going on with Brexit. Anyway, should we start? Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of a series of discussions with European think tank leaders to reflect on the nature of their work in a rapidly changing continent. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I am co-hosting this session with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the honor of having with us Fabian Zuleeg. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene for our discussion today?
Thank you, Enrique. We continue with this series of conversations with current and former directors of think tanks in Europe, in a way to document their successes and as well their struggles. In the first four episodes, we interviewed Sonja Stanovic-Gajic from the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, Peter Kreko from Political Capital Institute in Hungary, Karolina Vigura from Kultura Liberalna in Poland, and Vesela Cherneva, the Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And those were the first three guests, provided us a very interesting insights in what were, predominantly transition countries in the East, while the interview with Vesela opened a much bigger door for us about the new spectrum of pan-European think tank scene. And speaking of that, we were motivated by the great response that we got to these interviews and the lessons learned. And we thought that in the continuation of this series, we could look broadly at the think tanks in Europe. As listeners will attest, in these conversations we discuss with think tank leaders about their key strategic decisions, about moments when they decided to grow their organization, shrink, or change focus, how they navigated difficult political circumstances, and in a way we also ask them a more deeper question, whether still they believe in the value of the think tanks and the work they're doing. And talking about think tanks in Europe, it will be impossible and will be very incomplete if we have missed Brussels and the work, the important work that is done around the European Union. And that brings us to our next guest.
Thank you, Goran. So after this introduction to the series, let me welcome our guest, now formally, Fabian Zuleeg. He's the Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the European Policy Center, EPC, and he's been in this role since 2013. At EPC, Fabian has focused his work on a range of issues, including the political economy of the future of European integration and the fundamental transformations Europe has to go through, which clearly is a very, very current set of issues. But Fabian is also an active member of European and I would say a global conversation about think tanks. And I think this makes for a great combination for a great conversation about the changing context of think tanks and think tanks themselves. So welcome, Fabian.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
So, Fabian, it's really a pleasure to talk to you. And, we should probably start with discussing the context. But, knowing a thing or two about European Union and Brussels, asking you to talk about the context of your work probably will take a series of podcasts, not even a single one. So we thought to cut it short, maybe we can ask you if there was a song that can epitomize the context in which you work, what song that would be, what comes to your mind, and then feel free to elaborate some of the key aspects of that's what that song brings, but also of the environment in which you operate in Brussels and at Europe at large.
Sure. So the song really which comes to mind is Bob Dylan. The times they are changing, because for me this is really what is happening around us, not just at this moment in time. I mean, clearly we in a highly volatile time with the Trump 2.0 administration and everything that entails. But in fact, this has been a feature of leading a European think tank for the last well, decade and a half. We've been in what we've called a perma-crisis. So the times have been changing rather radically for quite some time. And that is also the big influence on our work. We have to adapt to the big strategic questions which are now on the table, which are, in the broadest sense, on the future of Europe.
Can I ask a question about the times they are changing? Because one of the things that struck me in the conversation we had with Carolina Wiguda a few weeks ago was she was saying that when Poland was thinking about Europe, sort of the West, and that ideal, and they started their journey towards getting closer to that ideal of Western Europe, they had an idea of what Europe was. And when they got in, finally, that Europe they had been aiming for had changed entirely. What do you think of that? And how has that change happened? So the times have been changing apparently for a long time.
Certainly, and I would also argue that the process of welcoming all these countries from mainly Central and Eastern Europe has also very much changed the European Union. So this is part of a process, but the Union has always gone through fits and starts. For some periods, it was rather more quiet, and then there was either through an external influence or coming from within momentum for change. But what we've seen over the last decade and a half or so is really much more rapid change and much more fundamental challenges. In particular, we are now in a world where the European Union has to deal essentially now with challenges which it cannot avoid. So it is no longer a choice of integrating further or moving forward, but it is dealing with costs which are being imposed on the union, mainly from outside. But that also has an impact on the cohesion within the union, the way the union works. So I would actually argue that what we've seen over the last years has been a more fundamental challenge to the structure of the European Union, to the way European integration has worked, and what we have now seen with the watershed moments of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now the second Trump administration is really putting into question the whole architecture of Europe, which was created after the Second World War and then extended to the east with the enlargements.
And Fabian, how has that changed the work of European Policy Center? I mean, obviously the politics has changed dramatically, and as somebody who has been following that field for a long time, I remember, when we talked about the EU integration and the new countries, there was a lot of technocratic speak, there were a lot of technical solutions and whatnot, and now suddenly, you talk about as well the permanent crisis. How has that affected not only the work of the EPC, but the entire think tank scene, in particularly speaking of Brussels, that has I would say, its own unique taste to think tanking?
I think there's a difference between how I would say it has affected the EPC and how it has affected the think tanks scene as a whole. For EPC, we made a decision quite some time ago, essentially when I became chief executive, that we really needed to focus on the central reason why we are in a think tank. What is it we want to achieve? What is it we are there for? Also because the times at that moment were not easy. Financially, it was quite challenging. So we wanted to really decide what is it that drives us to continue with this. And what we arrived at was essentially impact. The idea that we are doing this to achieve change, to achieve a different kind of policy environment which can address the challenges which Europe has. So starting from that, it also meant that we progressively, as the perma crisis moved on, started to move outside that, if you like, technical bubble, which is often the area of work for European think tanks. So looking at what is the legislation which is currently going through the parliament, what is on the work program of the commission, but rather focusing on the big picture questions, the critical questions, so questions around the future of European integration, questions around Brexit and the challenge that posed, the question of the European economic and social model. So all of that has also entailed changing the way we work. But there's a big challenge for that. And I think that challenge also leads to different think tanks making different choices. Very often, when you're talking to funders, they will tell you it's great that someone is doing this, but we can't fund it. That's not the kind of thing we are funding. And clearly, that's a challenge because as an independent think tank, we also have to continue to find funding. And like most European think tank, we don't have an endowment, we don't have large reserves we can rely on, so we have to fund ourselves on a year-by-year basis.
I mean, we'll ask you later about the funding, but I'm really curious because exactly in this period, the political, not only the political environment changed, but as well there was a rise of right and radical right, both as a political power, but also as an ideology. And these are not very friendly to evidence-based policy research and open debates. And I'm curious, how has that also, if at all, affected the style and the substance of your work?
Well, firstly, I think it had a very direct effect that we started to look into the influence of these actors on the European Union, on policy. I was just digging out something which we wrote in 2016 about the dangers of an illiberal Europe. So that very much also has influenced our way of looking at the European Union, because one of the key issues which has been posed by the rise of these kind of actors is actually the existence of European integration. In essence, these actors are not interested in European compromise. They're not interested in European integration. Rather, they see the European Union as the establishment, which needs to be defeated, which also goes against the neo-nationalist agenda, which many of these actors have. And by having this rise at the member state level, this has also posed a major challenge for European integration. In essence, we have seen fragmentation and polarization, which I think is rather obviously visible now, but it is certainly also something which needs to be addressed. And coming back to what I was saying in terms of how we understand our role, one of the key areas we're working on at this moment in time is to say, how do we deal with that when we have to make very ambitious, very brave decisions to deal with the challenges which we have at this moment?
Thank you, Fabian. Let me ask you. Let me broaden the question away from EPC and now looking at think tanks more broadly. Maybe the Brussels-based or European-focused think tanks. And I'm going to go back to this your choice of song. I'm a terrible Bob Dylan fan. And there's a whole paragraph there that I think is aimed at think tankers, right? So come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, right? I think we could change that for, come think tankers. And there's a whole reflection about, keeping your eyes open, there are chances that won't come again. Maybe, don't speak too soon because, things are changing. I think this is all very relevant to the decisions that think tanks have to make and the choices they make, right? The positions they choose on a particular debate, the long-term strategies. What do you think has been the role that think tanks in Europe have played over this period that, as you say, has seen increasing fragmentation, increasing polarization, and now puts, finds Europe in a very difficult situation. So have they fought against those trends? Have they supported those trends, maybe inadvertently? What do you think has been the general role that think tanks have played in this process?
Maybe two remarks to start with before I go into that question a bit more. I think, firstly, I've long believed that uh, democratic think tanks are a very important part of the policy environment, and they can play a similar role, of course, not the same role, because they have a different function, but a similar role like the free press. They can be an important component of the policy debate, and in particular of innovative policy ideas. The second remark really goes back to this question of democratic think tanks. I think one of the big challenges we have in the sector is that it's not very well defined. Everybody can call themselves a think tank, and some of them are deliberately using that as misinformation. We have a number of lobby organizations, increasingly also nefarious actors, people working for foreign governments, for example, who also call themselves think tank. And we also have within think tanks a huge variety. So it's difficult at times to say what do think tanks do when you have that big uh, bandwidth of different types of organizations. But if we're talking about, if you like, democratic and evidence-based think tanks, really the ones who are trying to improve policy through evidence and through debate, then I think we have played an important role over the years. But we also have found it quite difficult to come out of our safe zone and out of our comfort zone. And what I mean by that is the safe zone is to do with funding again. And I think very many questions around think tanks will come back to funding. So are you really going to do things differently if that risks your funding base? And that, I think, is a big question which a number of think tanks have answered differently. And I can understand that because the pressure is huge if you have to finance 50, 60 people, then you have to think about where does the money for that come from. But I also think intellectually, we've found it difficult to come out of our comfort zone. And in a sense, we also had the golden age for Europe reflected in the heads of think tankers, that we kind of thought we were on a progressive trajectory. Of course, not always, not in every place, but essentially there was this permissive, rather central political consensus, which also included European integration, where we would move forward over time. And I think what we are now experiencing is a very difficult development where that is not the case anymore. That we do not have that consensus, and we see that also within Europe, that we have, and I call them that deliberately. I know it's a strong term, but we have enemies within. Um, but also that this fragmentation, this polarization has affected all of our societies. So we need to think very differently about what we can achieve, and we have to be much more ambitious.
It's really interesting what you say. It reminds me, I mean, I've had a similar reflection around what's happened in my own country, Peru, in Latin America, over a similar period of time. A sort of a consensus of a sort of center, liberal, democratic group, both politicians, private sector, and think tanks, who to some extent thought there was no more debate on things. But around them, there were these arguments, these groups that were brewing and preparing themselves to sort of take over to some extent. And that's what we see today. And to some extent, the intellectual role that you've referred to clearly connects to the funding landscape, right? And the availability of funding. So I wonder, I mean, I understand, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how EPC is funded, sort of what's the arrangement. I understand you have funding from different donors, the EU, foundations, but also a membership model, like many other think tanks. Maybe that gives you also sort of some freedom to act, but other organizations maybe don't have the same funding structures and therefore might be more limited. What do you think? How do you think the funding of think tanks or the funding of policy research and policy advice needs to change to address these new challenges that sort of think tanks needs to step up to and engage with directly?
For EPC, I would say there are really three important aspects I would highlight. One is diversified funding. I have long believed that all funders have agendas, maybe not all the same kind of agenda, but there's always a goal behind funding. So it is good to have diversified funding because it also gives you the opportunity to not take money if you feel that the way that funder acts or the way they are demanding things from you is not acceptable. And we have also, even in very difficult financial times, been able to turn down funding, which comes back to the question also, which I raised, of impact. If you start taking funding for things you don't believe in, you cannot have the impact which you should be having. So that's one element. The second element has been foundations. Foundations have been very important for EPC. Um, they also have their own agenda, but generally they do give more freedom in terms of deciding, and to some extent, but I'll come back to that in a minute, they also provide organizational funding rather than project funding, which I think is critical. And the third element has been a different approach to fundraising, essentially. So we have very much moved away from a reactive model to a proactive model where we design what we want to work on, and then we talk to funders about how we can make that happen. Of course, that still involves many compromises, many changes, but it is, in our view, much less constraining than responding to invitations to tender. Also because, and that I think is a very worrying trend for the sector as a whole, I do believe that the strings attached and the underlying expectations which come with much of this kind of funding has actually increased dramatically over the last years. So
What,
if you are working,
like
for
what
example, for
expectations, for
government,
instance? Like which
sorry?
expectations? You mentioned the underlying expectations.
Well, I think if you work for governments, and I'm not talking here about the illiberal ones, the ones who want to influence. I mean, there it's rather clear. Actually, that's rather more simple because you know what their agenda is. But even the democratic big governments are much more willing to interfere in the work of think tanks, telling them what they expect in terms of what they publish, in terms of what they think, and particularly when it's their money which is financing particular projects. So think tanks being told that if you continue publishing this kind of thing, you can't expect to get research money from the government. That is something which has happened in some of the major European democracies. So that kind of influence, I think, is something which we have by and large been able to avoid. Clearly, there will always be attempts. Clearly, it is also difficult to work with certain actors, but we believe that by having diversified funding, by having also this base from foundations, and by determining ourselves what the project should look like, we can deal with that. But I would argue that the funding situation overall has deteriorated over the last decade and a half. What we are seeing now is a much more difficult environment, which I think also leads to difficult choices in many think tanks. And the biggest issue, I would say, for the sector as a whole is that there's very, very little organizational funding. Everything has become project funding, often rather uh, leanly calculated, meaning that it's very difficult to finance the wider organization through that project funding because there's not much left once you have paid for the researchers, etc. And that leads to a hamster wheel where you're just having to employ people to fulfill the contracts, then having to gain more contracts to be able to continue to employ these researchers. And in the end, I think if you take a step back, often notice that you're not doing any more of the really strategic work, the really long-term work, the kind also focusing on issues which are not directly in the interest of particular funders. So you are reducing your longer term impact for this short term situation. And I think this is a dilemma many think tanks are stuck in. Thankfully, I can say for EPC, we're not, partially because we have this diversified funding, but we are also feeling some of these pressures.
Right. Sorry if I stay on this point, and maybe this is a question for both you, Fabian, and Goran, since Goran, you've played the role of the funder for a very long time. Somebody was telling me not too long ago that at least in continental Europe, there is a sense of think tanks playing more of a technocratic role, kind of a cog in the bigger system. And therefore, the logic of funding is much more structured, through government funds, through public resources. Whereas in the US, maybe in Britain, it's more think tanks are seen as another vehicle to influence policy. And so it's one of those channels that an individual, a corporation, a philanthropic body, anyone who wants to get involved in policy would see as an option of funding. So inevitably, there are just more opportunities for think tanks to get funds from to fulfill their mission, whereas the continental European approach is a little bit more projectized, right? So what does the funder want to do? And then they think of a think tank as part of that process. And maybe there's something in the idiosyncrasy of the role of think tanks or the role of funding think tanks that just limits that availability of funds that you talk about, Fabian.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Goran will have something to say about that as well. But I would also say, also globally, things are changing. So it's not just in Europe. But
Right.
in Europe, yes, we did have this much more technocratic view of what think tanks do. And I've often said that, for me at least, many of the organizations which identify themselves as think tanks are, for me, research institutes, which has a different connotation. So I'm not saying that they are not important and that they don't have a role to play. Absolutely. But I think think tanks, in the way I understand them, have a different role. And that role is much more, if you like, activist. It's much more involved in policy making. It's doing a lot of things also behind the scenes. I think the most important work of think tanks is not what happens in the public eye, it is what happens behind closed doors, who are really inside the systems, inside the decision makers' heads. That's for me what a think tank should do. Now, research institutes, of course, do also an important job, and I wouldn't deny their right to continue to do that. But I also would say that at the moment, we are facing such a major challenge to our way of life that, at least for me, this would not be enough. I could not be in a situation where I would think I'm trying to fix a little bit what the interior of the car looks like when the big question is the whole car driving towards a cliff edge?
Mm. Or does the car have wheels, for example, to drive at all? No, I mean, Fabian, really being into the sector for a long time, actually, what you mentioned in a very kind words, I find it even more appalling, because the need for what you said, for looking at the big picture and looking at the big decisions, is totally unpaired with the funds that pro-democracy, progressive politicians will put for those causes. And just as an isolated example, but an example that really sets the tone, the MCC, the think tank that is funded by Hungary, who has been an endowment of 1.2 billion euros, that's something which is unthinkable. But the conservatives, in order to peddle their influence, are really, really putting the money where the mouth is. And I think that's very big, really a big difference. The second thing that you mentioned, I actually, and I will even mention it self-servingly, I wrote when On Think Tanks published the State of the Sector report for last year, and that was really worrying me in Europe. In my commentary on the European results, is that I saw these trends that democratic and pro-democracy politicians were getting tired of criticism, and then they were shutting down that criticism. While psychologically, this is understandable because they're attacked from their political opponents that are not there into the space to debate. I felt that this is also causing a lot of different issues, because it prevents the think tanks to do what they're best, meaning to provide a criticism, constructive criticism. Okay, let it be behind closed doors. We don't need to publish everything, and then pair it with some alternative solution and a big or a small decision that has to be made. But I also saw the bandwidth for that happening decreasing. So not only the funding, but as well how much politicians are eager to engage. But I want to shift gears a bit, because if we go this way, we in Europe, we can be very down and very pessimistic, while we still live in one of the best places on planet Earth to live. So let me let me ask you a question about the successes of EPC, because you've been there for 15 years, and this is a podcast that is really followed by other think tanks around the world and their funders, and it will be good to share. And when you think about EPC and your work there, like, what would you think that there are things that you've done right? And knowing that you're also a critical soul, if there are things that you would have done differently, feel free to put them there, those as well. But I want our listeners to hear also about the successes of EPC in your own mind.
Thank you, Goran. It's always good to be reminded also of the more positive side. And I would say, I've now been with EPC for more than 17 years. So It's been a long period also to see um, the impact of what we have done, and the way we have established ourselves really as an important voice in that debate. And I would say the big success I would say is the EPC already is uh, over 25 years old. So it's a bit like the classic picture of a tanker. It takes some time, some effort to move it in a different direction. But I think we've done, and we've moved from what I would say was rather an events-based model where we had very good discussions, but we didn't have the research, the analytical underpinning for many of the things we wanted to achieve. And that I think we have done over the last decade and a half. We have been able to really change gear with the different crises which Europe has gone through. So that's not always been a very positive story, but certainly we were very active in the economic and financial crisis, in Brexit, in COVID, and now in the Russian aggression. And there we've often also managed to anticipate. Just to give one example, we have continued working on Ukraine for a very long period, even when nobody was paying any attention to Ukraine at all, because we believed something was going to happen there. And it was going to be important to continue to be present there, which also puts us now in a position where we can have a real voice in that debate. Many of those successes have been behind the scenes, and some of them I will not even talk about, because part of why they have been successful is precisely because people are not aware of the role EPC might have played in some of those discussions. But there are many policy documents where I can also see our footprint. At times, you're reading something where you think that wording sounds rather familiar. And we have also managed to do that. For example, coining the term permacrisis was one of the big successes. Of course, it never gets acknowledged. That's what happens in a think tank. It gets picked up, but it's good to see those kind of concepts. And I think that's also for me one of the big conclusions I would draw from the changing landscape we've been in. I think think tanks have an even bigger role now to play, not only in providing recommendations, but also in framing the debate, in saying, what does this world look like? Because it's very important that there are these voices which can credibly say, no, you have to pay attention to the bigger picture. You have to pay attention to the big challenges which we're facing. And if you like, that's even though it's a rather negative way of putting it, but I think that has been one of our greatest successes, that we have been able to convince people that we are facing fundamental challenges. Because only when people start to recognize that these are fundamental, at times even existential challenges, will they start acting accordingly. And that, so for me, it's often when I give a talk that people say afterwards, well, that was rather depressing, or rather sobering. These are the kind of words which I use. And my response to that is good, because that's the way the world is. And it's good if people recognize that that's where we are at this moment.
It's interesting because you said before, it puts you in a good position if you were able to identify the problem, right? If people see EPC as being able to articulate what's happening or what's about to happen, then when things happen, they will turn to EPC to look for solutions, to look for advice. So having that effect on your audience, as you say, can be a positive thing, not necessarily a negative thing. And thank you very much for that, because it also makes us think of the challenge that many think tanks face and their funding often makes them do this, trying to demonstrate impact, when, as you say, it is very hard to do, and possibly not in your best interest to go around telling the world that you've had that influence, right? Because you want to play a role that doesn't interfere with those that have to make those decisions in government. And they see you as a supporter, maybe they see you as a critical friend, but not somebody that is going around sort of undermining their own role and their own positions, which is always a difficult balance for organizations. Let me move us on into. Sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Just to add something to that, because I think absolutely this is very difficult. Also, for example, we are more and more involved in track 1.5, track 2 negotiations. So semi-official negotiations where it's even more important to be secretive, to carry out things behind closed doors. But I think there's also an element to this where quite often think tankers also don't want to have that attention on them. And I think this is important to also recognize that we are now living in a world where that is becoming increasingly impossible. And I think this is something for the whole sector to think about. We are becoming political actors, especially when we are working for democratic, liberal democratic think tanks, then we will be attacked. We will be attacked personally. We will be attacked as organizations in different ways. We have already seen a number of security challenges for EPC. We have seen some of the other so-called think tanks slandering what we do. And that's also personally a difficult choice. And I think in that context, it's also important to emphasize that, yes, you have to have a thick skin, but also particular people are attacked much more and much more viciously. And I think this is particularly an issue for women. Female analysts are exposed to incredibly aggressive arguments, attacks, both in social media, but also in debates, in other settings. And that makes it very difficult to then keep going. And I think what we are seeing, and here, unfortunately, the Brexit experience is also something I can draw from. We are going to see that a number of people on a personal level will not be able to do this. They will simply say, I cannot be exposed to this on a daily basis. I cannot have the threats to my children, to my life, because that's as extreme as it gets. So that's something I think also the sector as a whole needs to deal with. And our funders also need to deal with. Our funders need to understand that we need much better support to be able to withstand in a much more aggressive, much more difficult environment.
Fabian, as much as this is a sad topic to discuss, I'm so glad that you're bringing it up, because actually, think tanks felt that for a certain period of time that they're outside of this, and the brunt of that attack, it was only on the human rights organizations and the governmental watchdogs, or those who were speaking up very loud and in public fora against the authoritarian governments or against authoritarians as such. But I think think not only that you're right to point out, you're right to say there is an action that needs to be done because that pressure is there. And it's one thing that, to say that it's no longer only that the think tankers have to have the brain, they also have to have a stomach for it. Usually it was the politicians who needed to have the both. Now, also the think tankers in the face of those attacks. But I think the other important message is really the need for funders and supporters of this work to really provide, and these are the means. Cyber attacks are not they're not jokes, they're serious. And it's one thing about shutting your website, it's another thing if somebody plants you illegal content on your hard drives. There's, the misogyny that you mentioned, especially towards female analysts and whatnot, online and so on, that's already a very clear form of bullying and needs to have often even a legal follow-up, which costs not only emotions and effort, it also costs money and support. But I think I will really say that and tie it in with what you mentioned before. This is necessary to support, let's say, our way of life, the European way of life, in which we believe in democracy and pluralism and this difference. And I think it's really good that you mentioned these things. Even my heart cries to learn that even think tankers now are part of that fray of the attacks of the other side.
It's rather dark, but I have to say that, and this also is coming to why I am a think tank and why I believe in doing what I'm doing. Unfortunately, I think we are in danger of repeating some of the darker moments of European history, and we need to collectively fight against that. And I am often now reminded of the 1920s, 1930s in Europe, when things were starting to turn bad. But often the liberal democratic forces spend more time fighting each other than they fought the extremists on all sides. And I always remember there's a quote, a small quote from a pastor in Nazi Germany who was talking about why he was fighting for the rights of Jews and others. That was Martin Niemöller. And the quote is, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I think this is unfortunately the world we are back in. We have to fight for democracy. We have to fight for the achievements we've had. It is not going to happen automatically. We are going to be part of that. And I think think tanks have a really important role to play in that.
Thank you, Fabian, and thank you for adding that sort of personal element to the reflection about think tanks and their role. And also to segue, easily allow us to segue into a conversation around the future. And you've already kind of alluded to many elements of what's happening now and what might happen in the future. But could you, as a way of sort of rounding up the interview as well, could you think about what is the direction of travel for pan-European think tanks such as EPC?
So I think what I would start with is always what is the policy environment which I expect, because that for me then determines where EPC should go. And unfortunately, this is when it's back to the sobering or depressing element, because I think we are facing an incredibly difficult period ahead of us, where um, all aspects of our way of life are on the line. Prosperity, security, sustainability, and democracy are all on the line. and we will have to do what we can to rescue these achievements for the next generations. So what this is about is for me very much to say what is the world we are going to give to our children, their children, because the worst case scenario is much worse than what we have now. The worst case scenario is, for example, Russian boots in the Baltics. It is, for example, the collapse of our economic and social model. It is nuclear proliferation. It is the collapse of the global weather system. These are apocalyptic, but unfortunately not unrealistic options, views of where the world might go. So for me, this is what a think tank is about. We have to find solutions which bring us onto a different path than that one. And that means making very hard choices. And I think this is something where also EPC is very, very active in, is to highlight what are the trade-offs, what are the difficult choices which now need to be made. And in that, I would hope that we would also be able to move forward as the sector as a whole. And you asked me beforehand also about aspects where I would be more critical. One of the issues which I'm rather disappointed about is that I have not managed so far to decisively move the sector as a whole, because it's always been a big interest of mine not to just look at a single organization, but to look at what can think tanks achieve together. How can we work together? How can we cooperate more effectively to highlight the important role which I think tanks can play? Unfortunately, that also requires money, and I have not been able to get the kind of funding which I think would be needed, which in the big scheme of things is not a lot of money, but unfortunately, in terms of think tank money, it seems to be a step too far. But that really would be my big plea on for funders, for those who believe in the democratic role think tanks can play, look at this kind of structural support, not just for EPC, but look at the sector as a whole and see, is there something where we can make the sector as a whole more sustainable, more able to address these big issues, more able to move the dial on the big strategic questions we're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that collective action, Fabian, has been missing for quite a while on the pro-democracy front when it comes to think tanks, and I think is overdue, not only as to counter the opponents, but also to really make a bigger impact of the sector. In closing, I have actually, you talked a lot about the big picture. I wanna ask one question about the small picture, because we expect you know, a lot of people who work for think tanks or those who are thinking about think tanks are listening to this podcast. Is there any kind of specific advice that you have to people who are either working in think tanks or consider a career in think tanks that you want to give? Given, you know, that you've enjoyed and stayed in the sector for such a long time, is there anything on that individual level in the day-to-day work of a think tanker in which you would like to give it as an advice to the people who are either working or consider working in the sector?
That's such a big question. I could have another whole podcast about it. Also, I think what the challenges are, because I think for many people who are starting in think tanks, the changes which have come with COVID are not necessarily good changes, because much of how you learn to be a think tanker is by watching others do it. So doing it online simply doesn't cut it. So one of my pieces of advice would be be involved, shadow people, be there in person when these things are happening, because nothing replaces the experience of seeing someone who has done this for a long time actually performing in the moment. The other thing I would just put as a very general advice, but also in light of the challenges which we have been talking about, you really have to want to do it. It's not something which you should choose because you think this is a great career, this will put you on a path to somewhere. That might be true, but if you really want to be a think tanker, it comes with quite a hefty price you're paying in many different ways. So you need to be really enthusiastic about achieving policy change, being one of those people who are in the back room when some of these discussions are happening.
This is so true. The doing and the being there rather than just thinking about outputs and communication activities from afar. Fabian, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. I have learned so much, and we could keep going. And I am sure there will be more to learn from your experience and your contributions to the sector for sure. Thank you.
Thank you,
The
Fabian.
series the series continues with think tank leaders from across Europe. You can find this episode and other episodes wherever you listen to your podcast or by visiting our website on thinktanks.org. From Goran and me, thank you very much.